Thank you very much, Marianne, and to all the conference partners and organisers for the invitation to speak here. Having never been, it's been a real pleasure to be in the city since Thursday. So for the next 25 minutes or so, responding to the invitation and to the wider conference theme, I wanted to briefly discuss a range of curatorial and research projects that I've been involved with over the past decade or so, which have all been interrelated to one particular concern, which is how to diversify and develop sustainable audiences for the modern and contemporary art museum. At the core of these projects has always been the two overriding questions. Obviously, what is the art museum for and who is it for? The answer to these questions has clearly changed over that decade or so, and particularly, as I think what I hopefully will talk about for the next half hour, particularly in relation to the shifts in technology and the changing spaces and places of where art is not only both produced, but as much of my experience is rooted in my work at Tate, and I was particularly interested to find out more about the research project and its bringing together curators, educationalists and marketing. As somebody who has worked across all those departments at Tate, and many more in fact, it's wonderful to see more projects trying to bridge those gaps, which I think increasingly are dissolving in the real world, but perhaps not so fast inside the museum. But as much of my experience is rooted in my work at Tate in London, I'd like to begin with a quote from Chris Durkan, director of Tate Modern until this year, who, in advance of the opening of the new Tate Modern extension, the Switch House, which is the building you can see here, which opened in May and June this year. In advance of the opening, he noted that the Museum of the Future is going to be completely different from a place where people come to admire. The Museum of the Future is going to be like a university, like a campus, where the art is one thing, but the fact that you have so many different encounters and that you can test your ideas out, that you can throw your questions out about gender, identity, about the world, about salaries. This is the Museum of the Future. This idea of the art museum as a discursive environment composed of dynamic sets of spaces, supporting and encouraging debate, is clearly rooted in the rise of public programming that began to emerge, certainly in the UK, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And in particular at Tate, where a new energy was invested in experimenting with new forms of public programming in advance of the opening of Tate Modern, which opened in 2000. Now known as Tate Britain, the building on the left, some of you may or may not have seen it before or visited, the old Tate Gallery at Millbank was used, importantly, as a testbed for new ideas and curatorial approaches to help inform future curatorial practice at Tate Modern. The most obvious pilot projects were related to the practice of commissioning. The Devines commissions at the old Tate, and on the left you can see a project from 1992 with the American artist Richard Serra. The most obvious pilot project commissioning, the Devines commissions at the old Tate, was a commissioning program for contemporary artists, which anticipated the commissioning program of the Turbine Hall in Tate Modern. And you can see Doris Salcedo's installation on the right. Testing what levels of risk the museum was prepared to take working with an artist, the commissions equally tested, and this is important, what level of interest such new commissions would generate for new audiences. At Tate Modern, some commissions proved, of course, more popular than others. The more spectacular, the more photographically compelling and media-friendly, the more visitors came, as was seen with the licensed The Weather Project in 2003. Despite the immense success of the opening of Tate Modern in 2000, by 2005, however, 5 years later, the British New Labour government, which we were under, was still concerned about the very limited level of access to culture, and particularly to art museums, and introduced new funding criteria with an emphasis on audience development and cultural diversity. Again, Tate Britain became a testing ground for new curatorial models of practice. And in 2005, we converted a monthly late exhibition opening, Friday nights, the first Friday of the month, into a new thematic platform. Named Late at Tate, the programme focused on commissioning and collaborating with a wide range of artists and other cultural practitioners, from performance, dance, music, poetry, architecture and design, creating a highly interdisciplinary programme that took the average audience from 450 visitors to 7,000 visitors within 6 months. And when I say that, I always want to highlight the fact that the budget for this was £500 for everything. So think 750 euros. So incredibly, extraordinarily cost-effective initiative. Embracing the idea of collaboration, we forged partnerships with other institutions and organisations from both the public and the private sector, including universities, theatre and dance companies, artist collectives, radio stations, TV companies, interactive technology specialists, and game designers. Behind Late at Tate Britain was the ethos to integrate the cultural values of public space into the art museum, creating a social self-selecting experience. Rather than targeting audiences defined by cultural policy categories, we aim to attract and develop audiences through shared and collective interests and curiosities, often intergenerational. An experiential and informal learning encounter with the art museum rather than creating a didactic or educational one. And here are a few examples, and here you can see that emphasis on socializing and networking, the whole introduction of socializing directly in the collection gallery spaces. Took some negotiation with conservation, but it worked, and now it's a very established. But socializing and networking and animating those values of public space were important. These are images from one of the Late at Tates that was designed around a Francis Bacon retrospective, an artist who had been very interested and committed to the ideas of risk and probability and chance, and who had tested those ideas in relation to gambling throughout his life. And we created the Tate Casino, which brought in a professional casino company to run a casino through the night. And alongside that, we had lectures about probability, chance, and risk, and talking about artists like Marcel Duchamp in relation to that. But it was also an opportunity to link historical and contemporary issues. Again, we had a lot of feedback from all audiences of different ages about what the value systems behind patronage and art collecting were. And we had a conference which was about art patronage and philanthropy, in which we had artists like Grayson Perry, some of you may have heard of, sitting alongside critics, curators, but we also invited the Minister for Culture and the Shadow Minister for Arts, who you see on the right, to come and speak on the same panels inside a public audience to discuss their positions. We also invited artists who were part of the commissions, artists called Martin Creed. He curated an entire Late at Tate as well, had a music band, curated a film program, invited other artists in. That's more performance. And then perhaps specifically of interest as an example here, and one of perhaps to begin with, one of the highest risk programs, this is going back 2007, was an event called Enslaved, which was one of the first full evening programs conceived and planned by Tate's Young People's program, Tate Forum, which was a collaboration between the Young People's Youth Club of Tate, along with the University of the Arts, a conglomeration of art schools in London, which brought together fashion, jewellery and design students in a 10-week fashion project which explored ideas of liberty, revolution and slavery in relation to the Tate collection. And then they subsequently created and designed their outfits, and then there was a whole evening of performances, talks, led by them, chosen by them, and in fact that proved to be one of the most popular events. And subsequently, Tate Forum, which is now known as Tate Collective, programs 5 Late at Tates a year across both sites of Tate Britain and Tate Modern, fully integrated into the program. That idea of embracing, more photographs, and needless to say, of course, what also happens at many of these events is that young people end up being commissioned and taken on in professional, vocational roles as well. But that idea of taking risks, particularly through public programming as a first point of contact, also follows through with commissioning artists to create new work and to encourage and support new models of practice working with artists. And this is an example and a slide of another collaboration with David Toop, a professor of sound and improvisation at the London College of Communications. And he has an orchestra called the Laptop Orchestra, which, like jazz, responds and improvises in the space to create new sound pieces. And again, you can see that juxtaposition of old and new going back to 2007. And then finally, a couple of projects from 2010, which were projects that commissioned interactive design groups and artist media companies who work with public space outside. And these were projects outside of Tate Britain, one based on game theory, the other on interactive light displays. And it became increasingly important for us to link the inside and the outside of the museum, particularly in London, where the privatisation of public space was really gathering momentum. It was about demonstrating that continuity of public value, both inside and outside. But as late at Tate, monthly audiences increased, however, there was still significant pressure and interest to understand why the missing audiences, as the government policy called it, the missing audiences of black, minority and ethnic backgrounds, and particularly young people from those backgrounds, were still missing from the museum's daily audiences, a particular and rightful concern of the New Labour. The initial analysis of this problem that we made in this research project was that, firstly, that despite high levels of discursive public programming rooted in academic discourses of post-colonialism, museology, art history, institutional critique, and so on, that it had absolutely no impact on curatorial practice or awareness of the issues outside of the museum. Second, that despite high levels of targeted curatorial and education programming based on market research and on marketing initiatives, no long-term shift in audiences had happened. So targeted programming produced big hit audiences once, but not sustainable repeat visitors. And thirdly, that although policy formation around cultural diversity was informed by considerable academic research in the social sciences, these overdetermined policy categories and marketing categories and demographics no longer held any meaning with the subjects of these categories themselves. They neither recognized themselves nor were they producing any function. So in order to address this problem of the missing audience, Tate Encounters identified the need to overcome this separation of policy, practice, and theory between the academy and government and the museum. And we created an interdisciplinary research team which was constructed and brought together academics, curators, and researchers whose collective disciplines spanned art history, visual cultures, social sciences, science and technology studies, social and cultural anthropology, policy studies, and digital media, so a big interdisciplinary team. And to connect these three areas of government policy and diasporic audience experience, the project developed three specific research strands. First of all, there was an ethnographic organizational study of Tate through both the study of a specific exhibition, which we tracked for 2 years, the development from start to finish, and a history of education practice since the creation of the Learning Department in the 1970s at Tate. The Learning Department historically being given that responsibility for creating audiences. And lastly, and perhaps most interest to this conference, was a 2-year fieldwork project with students from diasporic backgrounds who were actively engaged in the research, in its development, who directed it with us, and who, in the process, we constituted as co-researchers in the project. The research method that we subsequently designed over this 3-year period was what we would call a highly situated one, which is to say the full team and the student co-researchers took up residence for 3 years in the museum and had equal access to staff, collection and spaces as everyone else. All these interactions were documented by both the research team and the student co-researchers who opted back in 2007 for mobile phone use and photography. and was importantly defined by a critically reflexive approach, that they reflected actively on their experience. This combination of professional and all the material of this project is online and still online. The whole project was open access. And interestingly, the students opted not to be on the Tate website. They wanted their own platform, their own independent platform. So all of the project material is off-site, which was good. This combination of professional expertise combined with the student co-researcher's role also ensured that in approaching questions of diasporic experience and audiences, a knowledge base could be built up that could trace the relations between the life world of the students and as co-researchers and the life world of curators inside the museum. In doing so, the project aimed to create a field of study that would recognize the specificity of the visual, not as defined by the category of art or by art history inside the museum, but as a practice of viewing that connected the visual of the everyday with the practice of viewing and spectatorship in the art museum. And we ran a 4-week program of talks and panel discussions, of which 2 were led by the co-researchers, and people in the museum came, and this was in the heart of the museum. One of the things that by 2007 was agreed that no more educational projects with public facing would take place in educational spaces, that they must be in the heart of the museum. Amongst the key findings related to one of the research strands, the co-researchers alerted us very quickly, and you must remember this is 2007, a while ago now in digital time. The co-researchers alerted us very quickly to the impact digital technology was having on their understanding and experience of visual culture. This situation, produced by the impact of digital on the visual realm through the visual saturation of imagery, both through mobile digital capturing devices and online culture, dominated the research. As the Tate Encounters project found, while the art museum's display and exhibition practices were still rooted in the narratives and logic of what we would call aesthetic modernism, think white walls, plain walls, minimalist hang, and based on ideas of curatorial expertise and knowledge and rooted in art history, what we recognized was that such models of curatorship were no longer holding historical forms of authority over audiences or how contemporary audiences, and particularly younger audiences, were viewing or interpreting works of art. Indeed, we went as far to conclude in 2007 that the impact of digital technology on cultures of the visual meant that the art museum curator now stood in exactly the same position as the contemporary visitor and spectator of the artwork. Furthermore, the project concluded that identity, on which so much of these policy categories were being based, and marketing strategies, that identity was no longer based on a single coherent subject. Rather, that identity was understood as a multiple and competing set of subjectivities for each individual, particularly produced by the experience and condition of transmigration, particularly true for the diasporic audiences. But also that the impact of mobile camera photography, which was saturating visual culture, had fundamentally changed the meaning and experience of the visual in the art museum. Under these conditions, visuality, we concluded, could no longer be understood as a fixed form of visual encounter in the museum, but that visuality and experiences of visuality move with the subject, creating what we termed transvisuality, a kind of seeing on the move. Taking up one key area of these Tate Encounters findings, the impact of digital media, a second smaller research project, again with national funding, these were all with national research funding in the UK. A second smaller research project, Cultural Value in the Digital, was subsequently developed as a collaboration with Tate again. This was after I'd left Tate and gone to the Royal College of Art. As with Tate Encounters, the problem identified from the beginning was this disjuncture between policy formation and the museum and academia. Policy in the UK at this point around digital being primarily focused on the digitization of collections and documentation to increase audience access to collections. Secondly, that the museum's dominant curatorial construction of the audience was still as a passive consumer, this historical model of the one to the many, as I stand here in front of you, the one to the many. And that it still understood the museum visitor as a passive consumer. And equally, that academia's understanding of this shifts in and the impact of technology on the museum was still in a technologically determined analysis rather than an experiential one of the individual viewer. The need to understand more about the impact of technology on audiences, and particularly young audiences, had become further apparent in 2012 during a major 15-week-long program of performances, films and video in what was called the Tate Tanks, which opened as a taster and a kind of teaser in advance of this opening of the Switch House, this new extension to Tate Modern, the tanks being right at the bottom of the building. Opened as a taster and a teaser in advance of the opening of the Tate Modern. This 15-week program of performance, film, video, installation was composed of 3 parallel programs: film and video installation, curated performance, and importantly, a program called Undercurrent, led by Tate Collective, the Young People's Group. As Chris Durkin highlighted in the program notes, and this is the move from 2007 to 2015, a further question that the Tate Tanks brings to the forefront of discussion for museums is the changing role of the audience at a moment dominated by social media and new models of broadcast. Many of the works presented in the tanks address their audience directly, emphasizing the visitor's own physical presence, whether that be by being part of a crowd surrounding a performer, becoming part of a conversation, or walking through and around an immersive installation. With these complexities and the advent of new recording technologies, the live event takes on new meanings and possibilities. End of quote. As the Cultural Value and Digital Research Project rapidly discovered, the museum struggled to move beyond the historic conventional broadcast model of the transmission of knowledge, this one-to-many, and its default position to think of the digital as a tool rather than as a cultural condition, and specifically now a networked, distributed cultural condition, highlighted its bigger struggle to recognize the legitimacy and new cultural authority of the audience, which again held little or no interest in the modernist art historical system of classification and value. As Chris Durkin, the previous director of Tate Modern, went on to note, we can think of the museum in the 21st century as a new kind of mass medium, concluding they, the tanks, in the program The Tanks, challenge many aspects of what historically has been important to museums, i.e. their collections and modes of display and archive. And the tanks again ask vital new questions of what it is to be a museum in the 21st century. Anticipating this particular moment of the potential redundancy of the art museum's historical classification system based on the idea of the unique work of art, the material object, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, MACBA, had already in 2012 introduced a new cataloguing system that no longer made distinctions between the work of art, the archival document, and online generated content, and subsequently enabled the design of new content management systems inside the museum. MACBA's ability to adopt a radical method of collection management and display was clearly informed and enabled by the short history of its own collection, which began in 1987, which left it unburdened of the management of historical legacies and collection donations. But in its recognition of the shifting status and nature of the art object and the impact of technology on artists' practice and audiences, made it a sympathetic partner for us to develop a collaborative research focused on the nature of contemporary art practice and display, which culminated in a project called Transfigurations in 2013. This research, funded by the European Union, the project Museums in an Age of Migrations, was a multi-partnered 4-year project and further expanded upon the findings of Tate Encounters, particularly in terms of the shift in artist practices towards new technologies and the need to identify new collaborative models of both curatorial and artistic practice in what we always call problem-solving research. One of the key concerns of this research was to identify new forms of exhibition and display practice that overcame the old representational logic of the exhibition form, a key concern in relation to works of diasporic or migrant artists who were being presented in museum exhibitions, particularly around ideas of an essentialist identity, i.e. black artist or migrant artist, rather than just an artist. From the outset, the project had committed itself to producing a discursive exhibition that would take place at MACBA in the summer of 2014. Thinking towards this output of an exhibition, the need to develop a reflexive and collaborative form of co-practice between artists and curators was recognized, and 5 selected teams of artists and curators were brought together over a year-long period across London, Barcelona, Amsterdam, and Paris. In the case of Transfigurations, the material generated by the artists, including the French artist Camille Henrot, another French artist, Tate Encounters, and British artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan, evidenced the increasing precarity of the historic idea of the material fine art object, as each highlighted the extent to which their work draws on and remediates an ever-expanding repository of digitally generated content, be it museum collection image banks, and this is part of Camille Henrot's work, playlists of digitally generated music from iTunes, Tate Encounters, who often gives performance music lectures, and in fact in the last documenta also presented all his playlists, or amateur video and footage and sound recordings of the artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan. In reflecting on the research and findings, and these are installation shots of how we then presented the work as Tate Encounters at the back, and for MACBA this seemed to attract younger audiences than they expected. This exhibition was not an exhibition, and the durational attendance of audiences was longer than the average visit, which was interesting. This is the installation of Lawrence Abu Hamdan's work. In reflecting, I'm just coming towards the end now, in reflecting on the research and findings of Transfigurations, it is apparent, thinking about the future of the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, that we are clearly witnessing in the release and displacement of the art object from its fixed mode of representation and aesthetic value, in the release of the representation and aesthetic value into a new image-led online networked flow of new relational value systems. What a long, bad sentence that was. Essentially, what I'm talking about is how we've moved from that material object and work of art to a much more immaterial, non-object base that is circulating in a network distributed culture rather than to be seen as a work installed in the museum. This new mode of existence of the art object in a digital network culture is connecting the artwork not only to the viewer and the audience, but to the wider social entities and contexts in which it circulates as an object, image, thing, and experience. As Boris Groys has noted, the Curatorial and Curator, the internet is transforming and assuming the historic universalizing archival function of the museum. The transition of spatio-temporal relations within the museum through accelerated programming and performance-based event culture is taking place, and as Groys notes, the function of the museum becomes one of staging the flow, staging events that are now synchronized with the lifetime of spectators, rather than the lifetime of the curator. This was particularly exemplified in June during the opening events and projects of the new Tate Modern extension, the Switch House. One of these projects, Tate Exchange, which one floor of the new building takes up entirely, is described by Tate as an open experiment. And in the narrative and notes, and you can see this on the website if you look, it describes Tate Exchange as, Tate Exchange will be exploring the theme of exchange and will be led by artist Tim Etchells. In addition, we've invited more than 50 groups and organizations to be our associates and work closely with us throughout the year. These associates range from charities, universities, healthcare trusts, community radio stations, volunteer groups, to many, many more, both within and importantly beyond the arts. It's an ongoing program of events developed by artists, practitioners, and associates, aimed at building a dialogue around art, society, and the wider issues facing us all today. In short, it's a space for collaborative and innovative projects and a forum for anyone and everyone to get involved with art in new and unexpected ways. Inspired by the theme of exchange and the art on display in the galleries, our associates will collaborate openly and creatively with one another to develop lectures, performances, drop-in sessions, debates, and even art for the space. And it's very interesting that even art for the space, that the art now comes right at the end and may not even be part of the process. This is a shot of the Tate Collective, the young people's group, opening event for Tate Modern. While the new Tate Modern extension clearly has galleries, what is more apparent than ever is the experience of circulation and event rather than exhibition and display. The experience of the museum is now not just the event of the building, as we saw in the 1990s, but the event of people and time, and the event of the self-generated photograph uploaded to Instagram, Flickr, and now Snapchat. And all our presentations this morning that we saw obviously demonstrated that perfectly. It is perhaps worth noting what the nature of this online network culture is. Within 3 months of launching in October 2010, Instagram had generated 1 million users. On 21st of June this year, Instagram announced it had hit the 500 million user mark, of which 300 million were daily users, creating a global community of interests, sharing more than 80 million photos and videos every single day. In the same time frame, the Google Art Project, part of Google's Arts and Culture and Google Cultural Institute, was launched on the 1st of February 2011 in cooperation with 17 international museums, including Tate London, Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the Uffizi in Florence. Again, as of June this year, it includes over 1,000 national museums and galleries, from which over 45,000 digitized works are thematically tagged and presented as exhibitions in a seamless narrative of an extended museum and gallery experience. While access to Google's art project can be through the conventional front door of its website, the thousands and thousands of accruing images also proliferate and circulate as networked entities now, as they enter and expand the stock of networked images through Google Images. As predictions that by 2020, so 4 years away, 2020, 50 billion devices will be connected globally. The networked image of the art object will potentially become as ubiquitous as the networked Instagram photo. So where does this leave the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in a digitally online network culture? Questions of what to collect and what and who to represent, which audiences to attract and which to develop, and to develop them online, offline, and how to connect the two if the future museum is to remain both a building and an online space. With the ever-expansion of Google Art Project and Instagram, have we reached a point where the internet has rendered the museum the archive rather than the production site of cultural value and engagement? Rather than collect more objects, should the museum consider disaggregating its collection and redistributing it? In an apparently globally networked culture, what is the national representational role of a museum of modern and contemporary art? And I think that's particularly pertinent when I looked around this museum. These are the questions that current research project I'm involved with, and again, including people from Tate and curators and artists. And it's curious to have seen so many presentations so quickly this morning that moved straight into the digital moment. But those are just an insight into some of the things, and I hope there are points of connection that connected with some of the issues of the conference. Thank you very much.